Okay, sorry, got cut off there. So the slowness of muscle contractions fits its functional requirements. We want the extended contractions to maintain continuous tone in our blood vessel, in the walls of our blood vessels, in the uterus, and the urinary bladder. You don't want to, like I was saying, a bunch of random sporadic contractions. Smooth muscle is also fatigue resistant. The energy requirements are low compared to that of skeletal muscle, and it can maintain contraction without ATP through those latch brake mechanisms. So even that's good evolutionary thing. You don't want muscles that are this crucial to our body functionings, release from glands, regulation of blood vessels, airways. You don't want that to be dependent upon some type of ATP mechanism. There's also a broad length tension curve in smooth muscle. So if you remember the length tension curve, that idea was saying that in skeletal muscle, there's an optimal length for skeletal muscles to provide the strongest contraction. So when you have your muscle at full extension, when it's fully stretched, it's harder to contract. You're not going to get as forceful of contraction versus if it's already a little bit shorter, you can those heads will be able to contract even better. There is, though, that place where if your muscles are too short, if your muscles already contracted and those the fibers, the filaments rather, have already kind of slid over each other, they're only going to be able to contract so much. With smooth muscle, they don't really have that limitation. Because they don't have the Z-discs that define the contractile space, they can have you can contract forcefully even when 50% to 200% of resting length. Think about your bladder, think about the uterus. They can expand to incredible amounts and still be able to contract forcefully and still be able to contract fully. This having the myosin heads present in the center of the thick filaments is what allows that. Having the myosin heads present right there along the entire length of the fiber of the filament will just allow for stronger contractions. So smooth muscle is controlled through the autonomic nervous system. It's the involuntary nervous system that secretes transmitters. The muscle's response depends on the neurotransmitter that's released and the muscle's receptor for it. So it's both what is the chemical, what is the neurotransmitter that's going to be released, and what type of receptor does that muscle have. So, for example, acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. That's the one that I'm using right here. We'll use their example rather than going into mine. So for smooth muscle, the bronchioles, it contracts in response to acetylcholine and relaxes in response to norepinephrine. So the receptors on the bronchioles are going to act differently depending on the neurotransmitter. If they receive acetylcholine, they're going to contract. If they receive norepinephrine, they're going to dilate. You can kind of remember that if someone is going into anaphylactic shock, if they're having an allergic reaction, their airways close and they get the EpiPen injection, epinephrine, norepinephrine are there to help open up the airways. So epinephrine or norepinephrine will cause dilation of the bronchioles, whereas acetylcholine will cause constriction. With skeletal muscles, depends on the receptor. So skeletal muscles can have nicotinic and muscarinic receptors for acetylcholine. So you keep the neurotransmitter the same, but depending on the receptor that it binds to, it will cause a different type of action. Muscles will respond to stretch, so you can control them involuntarily through the nervous system and the transmitters. They can also respond to different types of stretch. So the myogenic and the stress relaxation responses. The myogenic response is that smooth muscle will contract in reaction to stretch. So as soon as it starts to get stretched a little bit, it will kind of contract back in on itself. But the stress relaxation response says that smooth muscle will relax after a prolonged stretch. So in your esophagus, as you're starting to swallow something, the myogenic response kicks in. So the bolus of food will expand the esophagus and stretch the smooth muscle, and they will contract to push food down. Once food enters into your stomach and it fills up your stomach will extend. It might kind of contract. It will resist that at first, but then after it realizes, oh no, we're full. There's really no, this stretch is going to stay. Then it will actually relax even more. So you have your myogenic response. If you have quick stretch, then it will contract to protect itself. If you have a prolonged stretch, then it will go into this stress relaxation response where it actually relaxes. Other factors, hormones, pH, O2 and CO2, different drugs, pacemaker cells, all these other different ways to regulate your smooth muscle. Again, think about all the different things that smooth muscle does and all the different places that it's located throughout our body, and you can start to get an image of, okay, there's a lot of different factors that go into controlling this. There are two different categories of smooth muscle. There are multi-unit and single unit. Multi-unit smooth muscle is arranged in units that receive stimulation to contract individually. We see these in the iris and the ciliary muscles of the eye, the erector pili muscles of the skin, larger air passages, so the larger airway passages, not the smaller ones, and the walls of the larger arteries. The degree of contraction depends on number of motor units activated, similar to skeletal muscle. So this is just units that receive stimulation to contract. Those individual units are going to contract. The more motor units activated, the bigger the contraction. Single unit smooth muscle cells are more common. They're stimulated to contract in unison as cells linked by gap junctions. So those allow for ions to flow in between the cells. And they form 2 or 3 sheets in the wall of a hollow organ. So they're more kind of layered around each other. You see them in the digestive tract, urinary and reproductive tracts, the respiratory tract, and in most blood vessels. You'll see them. So stimulation of a single unit muscle, smooth muscle, occurs through what are called varicosities, which are just swellings of autonomic neurons. So just enlargements of autonomic neurons. They contain synaptic vesicles with one type of neurotransmitter, so either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. And there are receptors for those scattered all across the sacrolemma of the smooth muscle cell. These are called diffuse junctions, so they will allow for that neurotransmitter to move into the cell. There are numerous smooth muscle cells stimulated simultaneously, and the stimulation spreads from the cell to cell via gap junctions, so contraction is synchronous. Those gap junctions allow cells to function in syncytium. The word is syncytium. It means that they're functioning all at once. So even though they are separate cells, these gap junctions allow that ion to flow immediately so that you get a whole response from the muscle. And these are just examples of those. So you have this multi-unit smooth muscle versus the single unit smooth muscle that just has that with these varicosities.